Truth and Reconciliation in Canada and Australia by Kira Winter. Hi everyone, my name is Kira Winter, and in this presentation I'll be talking about truth and reconciliation in both Canada and Australia. We'll look at how each country has addressed the harms caused to Indigenous peoples and what's being done today to move forward in meaningful ways. First, what is truth and reconciliation? First, it acknowledges the harms done through colonization, including the legacy of residential schools, the loss of land, language, and culture, and the intergenerational trauma that continues today. Second, it is focused on healing, justice, and rebuilding trust. Reconciliation is about more than just apologies. It means restoring respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples through empathy, accountability, and long-term systemic change. And third, it involves truth-telling and institutional change. This means honestly acknowledging past injustice and actively working to reform education systems, legal structures, and government policies that have historically caused harm. The purpose of this presentation. In this presentation, I want to explore how different countries have addressed colonial injustices, especially Canada and Australia. Both countries have a long-term history of harming Indigenous peoples, and this presentation will look at how they've responded to that history. We'll also look at how truth and reconciliation can look different depending on where you are, based on the country's culture, politics, and how involved Indigenous communities are in the process. Another important goal is to highlight how essential Indigenous knowledge is. Things like language, traditions, and leadership are all crucial for healing and rebuilding communities. And finally, I want to reflect on what makes reconciliation actually meaningful. Is it just symbolic or is it real? And who's responsible for making it happen? Global Indigenous perspectives. Truth and reconciliation doesn't look the same in every country. That's because each place has its own unique history and challenges, so the way they approach healing is going to be different too. And countries like Canada, Australia, South Africa, and some parts of Latin America are all trying to face their difficult past. That includes things like residential schools or violent conflicts that targeted Indigenous peoples. What's really important is that in many of these places, Indigenous communities are the ones leading the way. They're standing up, protecting their cultures, fighting for legal change, and changing their stories. Progress is happening, but it's not happening equally everywhere. Some countries have official truth commissions in place, while others are still struggling to take even basic steps forward. Even with all these differences, there are some common goals: honesty, healing, justice, and respect for Indigenous rights. These values are at the heart of truth and reconciliation all over the world. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was created to document the experiences of survivors in residential schools. Thousands of Indigenous peoples shared stories of trauma, cultural loss, and abuse. The Commission's 2015 final report confirmed that these schools amounted to cultural genocide. Importantly, the TRC introduced 94 calls to action, which are specific steps aimed at healing, justice, and rebuilding relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. The message was clear: acknowledging truth is the essential first step towards reconciliation. Implementation and ongoing initiatives. Since the TRC's final report, Canada has made progress on several fronts. Schools across the country now teach more about Indigenous history, residential schooling, and culture, so students better understand our collective past. The National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, also known as Orange Shirt Day, is now a federal holiday to honor survivors and raise awareness. Canada has officially adopted the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, pledging to respect Indigenous rights across legal and political systems. Communities are also developing healing initiatives and language revitalization programs. Yet challenges remain. Many Indigenous communities still face poverty, systemic racism, and limited access to essential services. That means reconciliation is far from complete, and it is an ongoing journey. Impact and challenges in Canada. Youth across Canada are becoming more active in speaking out and pushing for change, which brings hope for the future. Indigenous communities are also increasingly leading their own governance and decision-making, which helped rebuild self-determination. However, serious problems remain. The crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is a tragic and ongoing issue that needs urgent attention. Land disputes over traditional territories are also continue to challenge Indigenous rights. Systemic racism and inequality affect many aspects of Indigenous people's lives, including health, education, and justice, meaning there's still a lot of work to be done. Role of education, language, and governance. Education, language, and governance are cornerstones of reconciliation. Reviving Indigenous languages is about preserving culture and identity. When students learn Indigenous history and traditions, it increases mutual respect and understanding. Indigenous-led education ensures that cultural teaching is authentic and community-led. Governance is equally important, allowing Indigenous communities to make decisions about their land, resources, and systems supports self-determination. Together, these elements strengthen communities and lay the foundation for long-term healing. In Australia, reconciliation focuses on the legacy of stolen generations. When Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families by government policy, the 1997 Bringing Them Home report revealed the widespread trauma and loss caused by this policy. National Sorry Day, held annually, honors survivors and raises public awareness. However, Australia has not yet adopted a national framework like Canada calls to action. Debates continue over treaties, constitutional recognition, and formal legal acknowledgement of Indigenous peoples. The path towards justice and self-determination is still unfolding. Canada and Australia share similarities in their focus on truth-telling and healing, but their experiences differ. Canada concentrates on residential schools, while Australia focuses on child removal policies. Both countries commemorate their histories, Canada through Orange Shirt Day and Australia through National Sorry Day. Canada has formal truth commissions and actionable calls to action, whereas Australia is still considering treaties and legal recognition. Both nations face ongoing challenges like racial injustice, slow governance response, and unresolved land issues. Despite their different pathways, both countries are striving towards similar goals of reconciliation. Critical questions on reconciliation. Here are several critical and reflective questions that we must consider. Can there be reconciliation without returning land or power to Indigenous peoples? What role can non-Indigenous people play in this process? Are truth and reconciliation efforts just symbolic, or do they lead to real change? Who is responsible for making reconciliation happen, and how do we hold them accountable? What does meaningful reconciliation actually look like? Why truth-telling is essential. Truth-telling is the foundation of reconciliation. Healing cannot occur unless the past is acknowledged. Survivor stories give voices to lived experiences, ensuring they are not forgotten. When non-Indigenous people learn these truths, trust can begin to build across communities. Truth opens the door to justice. It helps identify wrongdoings, guide reform, and support genuine change. Without truth, any effort towards reconciliation remains superficial. Moving forward together. Moving forward is really important. The Indigenous leadership is the one guiding the path. They know what their communities need, and they've been doing this work for a long time. Education and awareness are also huge. When people learn the real history and understand what reconciliation actually means, that's when change starts to happen and it sticks. Reconciliation isn't just something for governments to deal with. Every single one of us has a role to play, whether it's speaking up, supporting Indigenous voices, or just being open to learning. It all matters. Even small things like listening, learning, and showing respect can make a big difference. This is a long journey. It won't happen overnight, but if we all keep taking steps forward, it will really be worth it. Thank you for listening.